I remember this feeling. You spend several hours in the street, in this crowd, and when you get back home, your facial muscle ache because of so much smiling, because everyone was so friendly and everyone was so happy to see each other and to realize that we are so many. However, when Putin chose to crack down, which he did after he was elected for president in 2012, after he was inaugurated, the tolerance was over.
This is the Rhyming Chaos podcast, where we interview people who have lived through or studied times of great upheaval or authoritarian takeover.
We hope these interviews can help us understand what is happening in the United States right now and how decent people can fight against it.
I'm Jeremy Goldkorn. My Jewish Latvian grandparents immigrated to South Africa before World War II. I grew up in the apartheid era just down the road from Elon Musk. I've lived in China for 20 years. And I've been living in Nashville, Tennessee, in the American South since 2015.
And I'm Maria Lipman. I grew up in post-Soviet Latvia and immigrated to America with my mom and brother. As a teenager, I have studied China and Russia for nearly 2 decades and have been living in Atlanta, Georgia since 2016, where I teach authoritarian politics, amongst other topics, at Georgia State University. Today, we're really happy to be speaking to Maria Lipman, a renowned expert on Russian politics, media, and state society relations. She's currently a visiting scholar at George Washington University and an editor of Russia.Post. Previously, she was at the Carnegie Moscow Center, the Russian branch of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where I first met her in prehistoric times as a visiting scholar in 2010. She was also an editor of Pro and Contra Journal and a columnist for the Washington Post, amongst other roles. Welcome to the podcast, Maria Lipman, and it's wonderful and a big honor to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me.
Maria, welcome again to Rhyming Chaos. Can I start by asking you a little bit about the Soviet Union and what it was like to work in Moscow in the late 1970s and 80s as the Soviet economic machine was straining and just before glasnost and perestroika and such reformist ideas were promoted by Gorbachev?
Indeed, Maria referred to 2010 as prehistoric times, and now you're asking me about the 70s, 1970s, surely prehistoric, pre-prehistoric. Indeed, I graduated from the Moscow State University in 1974, and that period was routinely referred to as stagnation. However, as any label, it oversimplifies the picture, and that was, of course, the time of repressions against the dissidents, but also the time when all kinds of intellectual, artistic, and spiritual pursuits were around. They usually were illegal or semi-legal, but there were plenty in big urban centers, and especially, I think, in Moscow. It was also the time of underground economic activities, also illegal, and the rise of the Soviet consumer society, a peculiar development given that the Soviet Union was an economy of shortages. Of course, in a country, any country, but especially a country as large as the Soviet Union, it's hard to give you a snapshot because it was so different. If you were in a big urban center, and especially Moscow, or if you were in the provinces. But I think one thing about the late Soviet Union is important to your listeners, and this is a very broad infatuation with the West and with things Western, all kinds of things Western. Especially, of course, among the younger Russians, younger Soviet people, but I would say even older generations as well. To some, it was opening the world through foreign radios like the Voice of America, like Radio Liberty, the BBC, for the voice of truth about the world. But maybe even more importantly, it was a very important source of coveted pop music, pop culture, but especially, of course, pop music for younger Soviet people. I don't think my life is in any way typical. As I said, I graduated in 1974, and my idea was to have as little to do with the state as possible. In my milieu, liberal intellectuals in Moscow, it was common in this milieu, but certainly not common across the country. Like you tried to somehow live quietly so that the government would not pay attention to you. And what I did professionally after graduation was mostly translating back and forth written translation. And for some reason, it was medical translation. That was the work that I could find that actually really kept me below the radar. It was not something that promised a career. It was not something that promised important salary, but it enabled me to work from home. It enabled me to have some free time and still do something that I liked because, the English language was always very good for me. I think I have a good enough knowledge of English when I graduated, so translations were not a problem, and it was an interesting work to do.
Can we go back to the period of stagnation, Zastoya, and you talked about how characterizing it as sort of the way we characterize it in terms of oversimplification. Can you talk a little bit more about what this period was like in terms of the repressions you mentioned, but also areas or spaces for resistance that you observed in that time?
Indeed, as I said, stagnation is a common term, how the period is described. And I think it has to do first and foremost about the Soviet politics, because this was the time when the main ruling body, the Politburo, consisted of old and aging men, not healthy. And they grew older and older, and it seemed that it would be forever. Indeed, it seemed that this regime, this order would last forever. Until in early 1980s, they started dying, and were dying every year. 3 consecutive secretary generals of the Soviet Communist Party died one after another, which was, of course, a source of a stream of political jokes. Political jokes, indeed, were everywhere. This was a ubiquitous phenomenon at that time. This is important because this was a very clear indication that the communist ideology in the Soviet Union was an ideological state which pledged on adherence to Marxism or Marxism-Leninism, but it was actually reduced to something that was completely hollow. Nobody believed it. Nobody gave a damn about this ideology, this philosophy. And yet everyone, or at least people with higher education, were expected to pledge allegiance to it. So this is, I think, what characterized stagnation. Nothing changing politically, the sense that it would be forever, very broad hypocrisy. So I pledge allegiance because this is a safe way of existing, but I don't believe what I say. And this is something that was the experience of so many people in the Soviet Union. Talking about resistance, yes, there was resistance, and there was this very, very important phenomenon of Soviet dissidents, but it shouldn't be seen as political resistance. In their later interviews, Soviet dissidents, way after the Soviet Union collapsed, said so themselves, that to them it was a moral cause. It was a matter of moral resistance. I'm sick of telling lies. I will tell the truth. I will not abide by the demand of pledging allegiance to something that I don't believe. And if this costs me my freedom, let it be it. And many of them went to jail indeed. However, they were not a large group of people. They were actually very, very little, very few, given that the Soviet Union was a country of 280 million people. And they were not a political movement. And they were, in fact, averse to any kind of political organization. So that was the dissidents. Another avenue was the underground publications that they produced. Political, but sometimes broader than that, called samizdat, a term that is very common and known beyond Russia today, meaning self-publishing. This was before computers, so multiplied using typewriters and disseminated clandestine fashion among friends and friends of friends and friends of friends of friends. So that was another avenue. But there was also what I already mentioned, a variety of intellectual, artistic, and spiritual pursuits that were not legal, that were not endorsed by the communist leadership, but still many people engaged in small circles and people's apartments and all kinds of pursuits that flourished later when perestroika began with the advent of Mikhail Gorbachev and when major changes began in the Soviet Union.
Maria, you worked as a translator, researcher, and contributor for the Washington Post from 1991 to 1995. From 2001 till 2011, you also wrote an op-ed column for the Washington Post. So you began working for Western and independent media right after the fall of the Soviet Union and into more recent times. These periods roughly correspond with two different epochs, the new post-Soviet democracy and the rise of the oligarchs, and then the beginning of the Putin era. What was it like to live and work as a journalist in Russia at those times? And did you sense that change was coming in the late 1990s?
Well, of course, the time following the collapse of the Soviet Union was the time, and actually, let me say the time leading to it, late 80s, late perestroika, was for many people in the Soviet Union. I would not say for everyone. I'm not even sure for a majority, but for many people in the Soviet Union, it was a time of freedom. It was the time when things began to open up, when what used to be illegal became legal, when what was banned was no longer banned. And this in itself, of course, was an enjoyable time to many people. But increasingly, and especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the early 90s, and all through, I would say, all through the 90s, this was also the time of impoverishment, the time of huge disparity of income unheard of in the Soviet Union, a time of confusion, a time when the habitual safety net collapsed. And for those who actually benefited by this time, whether economically or people, I should say like myself, who could find an interesting job and do something that had been unheard of before, I think many of these people, and I would say myself as well, did not realize how hard it was for a vast majority of Soviet and then Russian people. So it was different. And to call it a time of democracy, I think would be to largely oversimplify the period. It was the time of chaos in many ways. It was the time when the omnipotent state suddenly all but disappeared, giving way to various forces and various self-seeking individuals and groups that actually benefited at other people's expense. It was only later that, and I'm here speaking about myself as well, that many of us realized just how hard this time was for so many people. What a gigantic shock this was. It was a very good time for young journalists, that's for sure. New publications emerged, actually emulating the best foreign publications, and this was done pretty openly. One of Russia's first independent papers said point blank that we are trying to become the Russian New York Times, or the first Russian privately owned television sought to emulate CNN. And again, nobody at that point thought that emulating the Western models, that there was something wrong about that. And maybe to some in Russia, this is not something to admire. We are a large and proud country, maybe not in great shape right now, but why should we be emulating the force, the culture that used to be our enemy only up until very recently, and that actually acts as the winner and acts as the winning force on the global stage. So it was a complicated time, but it was indeed very good for those young journalists who wanted to do a good job and build Russian media the way the Russian media had never existed, or at least certainly did not exist throughout the 70 years of the Soviet regime.
Maria, just to follow up on this, the good time for young journalists and yourself working as a journalist, can you give some maybe illustrations of how it felt like in the 90s as you were writing and producing this work? Did you feel like there was a full freedom of speech kind of sentiment that you could do and say anything and you could choose where you work in comparison to maybe the Soviet time where you probably were assigned certain work units, or I'm imagining there was less choice on all fronts? Did that feel very liberating? Like, what was like a day like in your work? If you can remember, like a day of coming into the office, what was that like? Like, what did the feeling was like, and what was the energy like in that moment or in that particular day in your life in the early 90s?
This would not be early 90s, because in early 90s, I worked for the Moscow Bureau of the Washington Post as a translator and researcher. It was actually helping American reporters of the Washington Post the way I could. But beginning in 95, I was invited to actually launch the first ever Russian news weekly magazine, a genre that did not exist in the Soviet Union before. We were also emulating Newsweek. In fact, our publication, the news magazine called Itogi, which means summing up, had a partner. And on the cover of that publication, it said, with Newsweek. Newsweek was the model to emulate. Newsweek was a partner. And Newsweek helped us with mastering this genre of the newsweekly magazine, which at that point, well, now it's a kind of genre that is almost dead or maybe completely dead. But in 95, 96, when we were launching, this was actually the genre was in its prime, I think. So it was fascinating. It was really fascinating. And especially for myself, I would say that, as I mentioned, after those years when I tried to keep as low profile as possible and try to have as little, to have something that would be the exact opposite of an interesting career. Suddenly, I had this exciting job. So I was co-founder and then deputy editor of the first Russian newsweekly magazine. We were mastering the art of magazine stories, of photography, how graphics were important, captions were important. We had a terrific staff. We had wonderful journalists, some of which with some Soviet background, some very young. And it was a great time because everyone was extremely enthusiastic about what they were doing. Because for political journalists, politicians, and policymakers were really easily approachable and even eager to share what they thought about the new country, building this new country, the Russian Federation, with political reporters. And it was, I think, just as interesting and exciting for economics reporters because Russia was building a market economy. And I would say for anyone who worked for us, we had a team of about 80 people. And I think I can say that everyone was extremely enthusiastic. So it was a very good time for all of us there. And in this, I don't think my magazine was unique. I think this was true of journalists in other new Russian publications. Talking about the audience, I think we should draw a line between New Russian Television, which was also launched, privately owned television stations. And one of those television stations called NTV very quickly became fairly popular among the Russian people. Print press never enjoyed extremely broad popularity. And I think the audience, our readership was loyal, but it was mostly people who lived in Moscow, maybe St. Petersburg, maybe some other big cities. But it was a very special audience, well-educated, westernized liberals, which I don't think we saw as a problem at that time. But in fact, the limited impact was certainly a factor that we realized only later.
In our discussion before we recorded this podcast, you talk about the period immediately after the dissolution of the Soviet Union as, quote, a rare period in Russian history when the state was radically weakened, end of quote. But you also said that, quote, this did not lead to institutionalized empowerment of the people and democracy. What did Russia get instead of this democratic vision, prophecy, or just an actual democracy? What was the outcome that you observed and studied during that period?
Yeah, this is indeed a very important distinction. Throughout the Russian history, for very rare examples of rare periods, the political pattern was that of an omnipotent state and powerless people, and no institutions of democracy as we know in the West. Now, the 90s were one of those very rare periods in the Russian history when the state radically weakened, which did not necessarily lead to the empowerment of the people. It was the time when both the people and the state were weak. It was much more a time of chaos and weakened state than it was the time of democracy and people's power. Again, this is something that I think was rationalized later because it is, you, Jeremy, used this word democracy, time of democracy in Russia in the 90s. This was very broadly seen this way back then in the 90s, and I would say even up until today, even though, in fact, in retrospect, it doesn't look that way. It was not about democracy. It was much more about, again, weakened state and unregulated, uncharted space, which actually contributed quite a bit to the success of Vladimir Putin's early years. Because I think he very quickly realized, and I think any politician would have in his place, that the people were sick and tired of the chaos, of the confusion, of instability. So he started with delivering stability, and he actually made this pledge. Late 90s, very late 90s, shortly before Vladimir Putin became president, Russia had an environment in which none institution of power enjoyed any popularity whatsoever. Not the presidency, not the parliament, not the judiciary, whatever you take. There was no respect, no popularity, no support for any institution. So when Vladimir Putin first emerged, he made it very clear, I am in charge. And people actually were grateful to him for that. After that, he had an amazing stroke of luck because the price of oil began to rise very quickly in early 2000. So he was able to deliver not just stability, but also prosperity, which meant that by 2008, when he stepped down, technically, in fact, he didn't, but when he ended his second term as president, he enjoyed immense popularity. The way he went about it, the way he went about delivering stability was by consolidating power in the center, the way it has been traditional in Russia for centuries before him. This was, again, a habitual pattern. Power concentrated in the center, be it the Tsar, the emperor of the Russian Empire, or when there was no parliament in the Russian Empire, or under the commissars, as the expression goes, in the Soviet Union, when the power was concentrated in the topmost part of the Communist Party. And institutions existed technically, they were provided for in the constitution, but in fact, they were powerless in the Soviet Union. So Putin returned gradually, and I would say carefully, especially at the beginning. He started pushing the country in that direction. And again, people were grateful to him for that and sighed with relief that chaos was coming to an end and stability, precious, coveted stability, yearned for stability was coming back. And again, as I mentioned, he was also able to deliver growing prosperity because of the rising price of oil.
And what were some of his first targets as he started to recentralize control? What were the institutions or the societal sectors that he started targeting initially?
Well, I would mention two major directions. One was the oligarchs. The oligarch people who enriched themselves tremendously in the 90s, accumulated gigantic power at the expense of weakened state, and acted, and there was the saying that Russia is ruled by people who own it. So the most rich people, the most prosperous oligarchs had tremendous informal power. So he went after the oligarchs, especially two of them. And to make a long story short, he forced both of them to leave Russia and stay abroad and never to come back. The other direction of his attack was television. He realized just how important television was. There was plenty of evidence for that, how important television was in time for elections, television propaganda, how it worked to boost the popularity of pro-Kremlin forces. So he had enough evidence to know that he needed control over television. Coincidentally, both oligarchs were forced out from Russia and forced to stay away from their country, owned two of the three largest television stations with massive news coverage. So he was after television as well. And very soon, by the end of his first term, or even before that, so at that point, Russia had 4-year terms for presidency. Before his first term was over, television, national television stations with news coverage were under the government control. the oligarchs were, of course, not limited to just those two people. The fact that two very powerful and very rich individuals were forced out of the country was taken as a lesson by others. Stay put. The government does not mind if you are enriching yourselves further, but the government does mind if you mess up with politics. A third oligarch, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who did not take the lesson, who still thought of himself as very influential and thought that he could act with impunity, learned the hard way. He was not forced out abroad. He served 10 years in jail before he was able to leave Russia. So this policy, and at that point, this was before Putin's regime started going after political activists or journalists. This was a very clear lesson, a very clear message. Politics, policymaking is mine, is ours. It is concentrated in the Kremlin, and we will not let anyone mess up with politics. The message was well taken. And indeed, there were still attempts by political activists to engage somehow politically, but it was getting harder and harder and gradually more and more dangerous.
Maria, did you anticipate these things when you were observing Russian politics? Did you feel that you kind of had a sense that these things were going to happen, or was it surprising to you?
Yes, I did anticipate these things because my News Weekly magazine was part of the same media group or media empire owned by one of the two oligarchs who I mentioned, who was very quickly pushed out of the country. So when Putin went after television, after this privately owned television station, well, my publication, as well as other minor publications in that media group, found themselves as collateral damage. All of us were taken over. Now, what it meant for me and for my colleagues at my News Weekly magazine, and here we're talking about the spring of 2001, was that in one day, our publication was taken over by Gazprom, which is a gigantic gas monopoly, basically a branch of the state. Technically, it was not, but in fact, it was. And what actually the new owner did was to fire all 80 of us in one day, beginning from the top editor and down to fact checkers and proofreaders. Everyone was fired. So to me, I mean, it didn't take clairvoyance and it didn't take to have an especially deep understanding of Putin's nature. It was what was happening to me personally and the people around me, my close colleagues and friends. We understood that we were collateral damage, that the campaign was not after us. But we also understood the purpose and the driving force of Putin's policy. He wanted to concentrate power in his hands, and he wanted to remain unchallenged and uncontested. That's why pushing out oligarchs, that's why control over television, that's why control over politics, even though at that point, as I mentioned, the system was not as repressive as it had grown, as it grew later, and was not after political activists and individual journalists. But it was very clear what the purpose was. Just how it will evolve, of course, I couldn't say at the time, but that he would not stop until he had full control. There were other signs which came later, but in 2001, it was pretty clear that once you opt for control instead of competition, instead of contestation, which is actually the core of a democratic system, control is never enough. It was clear that he would not stop. It was another 10 years when a new, very abrupt turn toward repressive governance took place in Russia. And I'm talking about a period beginning in late 2011 and through the spring of 2012, the time of mass protests in Russia, political protests, and we didn't see it coming because at first the government was pretty permissive and people were protesting and they were chanting down with Putin and all kinds of things that were apparently not to Putin's taste. It was, on the one hand, I think I understood, and I wrote about that at the time, that the protest was not powerful enough. and was not organized enough to become a political force. But of course, I did not know just how it would evolve. It was a very major turning point, watershed in Russia, the spring of 2012, when the government began to go after individuals, to go after political activists, to be sending a signal that not only it would not tolerate big political players, but it would not tolerate any political activism, even at a reasonably small scale.
And this is also the period of the rise of Navalny, right? When he was speaking at these big rallies. I remember watching those videos and rallying all these people to come in this mass numbers. And I remember the sense of hope at the time that maybe something would actually, drastically shift. There was journalists joining in protest movements, and just it was exhilarating watching it from afar. And despite this repression ramping up, there was also the sense that maybe something will really change. Is that how you felt when you were watching it? Or you were there at the time, right? You were actually living there.
Yes, this was indeed the time when Alexei Navalny first emerged in the public space, and he was a striking and amazing figure in Russia, where public politics at that time was barely existing. I think there was a realization that Putin, the Kremlin, wants control of politics for themselves. So what is the whole point? There are all kinds of interesting pursuits in culture, in science, in business, what have you. The 2000s, in this sense, was a good time. It was a good time when anyone with any ambition, except political, could actually fulfill themselves and earn whatever they sought, fame, money, renown, what have you. So politics was not interesting, not exciting. It didn't promise anything. And suddenly this young man, Alexei Navalny, emerged, and he made politics attractive. He made politics exciting. Navalny was an absolutely unique figure, a natural-born politician, a man who was born to a country where there was no public politics to speak of, who was able to actually share his sense with the people, and people trusted him and were joined his ranks, joined his effort. I would say even at that time, I was not very hopeful. And as I mentioned, I wrote about it very soon. The protest did not seem well organized to me. And much as people were excited, they did not realize they actually did not have a plan. And they were not interested in political action. Those among the speakers at the gigantic rallies that took place in Moscow who actually tried to speak politically and to call the crowd for organizing somehow to then take a message to the government, these are our demands. Let's negotiate. The response from the crowd was mostly, there was this common chant, "Мы здесь власть," we are the power. So there was this excitement of being so many in the square, which actually generated an illusion that we are strong, which was not the case. And there were never negotiations. There were never an attempt to form a political party, to somehow organize and channel this energy of anger against the authorities in the Kremlin into something that would be organized political action. So I was not especially enthusiastic about that, but the atmosphere in the squares, sure enough, was fascinating and was greatly inspiring. And I remember this feeling, you spend several hours in the street, in this crowd, and when you get back home, your facial muscle ache because of so much smiling, because everyone was so friendly and everyone was so happy to see each other and to realize that we are so many. However, when Putin chose to crack down, which he did after he was elected for president in 2012, after he was inaugurated, the tolerance was over. And instead of these peaceful, happy, vast public protests, there were many arrests, long prison terms, and the situation changed quite abruptly. Did I see it coming? I would say no. And I think there is this illusion when you join the protests week after week, when you see all these people around you, these friendly faces, and the police is there, but it doesn't interfere. Nobody is roughed up. Nobody is detained. You somehow stupidly expect that this is going to be the case forever. But of course, when the police acted, it was no longer fascinating and exciting. It was scary. It was alarming. And it was clear that this portended more repressions that lay ahead.
Yeah, this makes me think of the current news cycle in Los Angeles with people protesting and this mass numbers and the National Guard being sent in for the first time in however many years to basically crash or impede on this protest. So this also brings me to the comparative lens here of the United States, where we're all currently living, as you have been living here for how many years now since the latest move?
Well, living, I would not call it living, but
Oh, not yet?
no, I don't have an American passport.
Existing.
Right, existing, staying 3 years.
Mm-hmm. 3 years.
Ever since the large-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022.
And of course, we're experiencing the rise of authoritarian politics here, or the return of this politics, I guess, depending how we see Trump's first term. Are you noticing certain turning points in American politics and society that make you wary of authoritarianism here? And if so, what are they, especially based on your experience of living and studying Russia?
Well, I have to admit that I was quite a bit struck by the fragility of the institutions that the United States has prided itself of for centuries, actually. You know, the separation of powers, the rule of law, the independent judiciary, the Constitution that is the sacred charter that has been there for, well, since the very beginning. Very striking difference from Russia when we're down to our fifth or sixth constitution since over the past 100 plus years. And still, it turned out that these institutions were not as solid and did not protect the American democracy and the freedoms the way they were expected to. And this was striking. However, well, I think that maybe after the initial shock, the judiciary has demonstrated that they can resist. And there have been, I think, impressive cases of judges who would not bend, who would not be intimidated, and who insisted on what they believe is the American law, which should not be violated. So I would say it is still so very different from what we have in Russia. I mean, I understand that there is a desire to compare. However, you know, the American society is divided, even polarized, or a two-party is not one. In Russia, we have technically maybe 4 in the Russian parliament, but in fact, power is concentrated in the Kremlin, and this is a kind of power that is uncontested and unchallenged. Nobody canceled elections in the United States. Local elections, I'm sure, will deliver different results in different states. American media do not speak in one voice, to say the least. The New York Times still exists. American stand-up comedians continue making jokes and get away with it, at least so far. So there is no comparison. Even though some of the developments are pretty alarming, and it seems like, well, this is not something Americans could have expected to be happening in their country. And I know that many are horrified. However, I don't think comparison with a system such as Russian makes any sense and actually may help Americans understand what is going on in their country.
So, Maria, are you saying that we don't have much to worry about, or rather, do you think that we are in the United States still able to fight against authoritarianism and that we're not completely bending the knee?
I wouldn't actually forecast. I certainly wouldn't. And to say that there is hope for American democracy, there isn't any hope for American democracy is not up to me to say. I know and understand and have been watching my own country for decades. But I'm by no means an American, and I by no means know enough to say what's in store in the United States. What I want to say is that comparison with Russia would not help the United States, it would not help people in the United States get a better idea of what's in store for them. The two systems are too different. The traditions are too different. The histories are too different. It is very important that, the reason why it was relatively easy for Vladimir Putin to establish full control over first the political scene in Russia and then gradually more and more over the social aspect of life in Russia is because he is relying on a very long tradition. It's because it is habitual. It is understandable. The omnipotent state and people who realize and accept the idea that big politics, big decisions, war and peace is up to them, not us. It's up to them to decide. And this is accepted as a fact of life. Still, Putin relies very much on this tradition. The state is omnipotent and the state is the most important thing, more important than people. Maybe they would not word it this way, but this is certainly an understanding. And also, I would say that as Putin was reestablishing tight centralized control, he was acting very systematically, whereas what is happening in the United States today looks a bit chaotic. I wouldn't say that this is systematic and we understand, well, now independence is lost here and tomorrow it will be there, but it doesn't look to me this way. So this is something, I think, something to realize. Comparisons are not very useful. When something unexpected is happening in your country, it may be natural to look for analogies, but analogies do not help very much.
And thinking about dissent and resistance as a major theme of our podcast, and you work extensively as a journalist, but also have written a lot about Russian media. In your opinion, what role have the more critical Russian journalists and intellectuals played up until Putin's regime heralded this large-scale invasion of Ukraine?
Well, it's a difficult question because on the one hand, I think that the 2 decades, and especially maybe the 2000s, when there was much more money in the media sphere, but we can even talk about these first 2 decades after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when journalism was developing, professionalizing in Russia, where lots very talented journalists mastering of the art, technology, method, style, what have you, of journalism. There has never been a shortage of very talented and very brave people. Some of them indeed reached world fame. So that's one thing. But apart from the journalists themselves and the media themselves, there's always the issue of the impact. And here, I don't think we can say that non-governmental media, no matter how great the skills, how talented the people, how fearless some of those journalists were, that Russian media ever had a serious impact on policymaking. So if we talk about the 2000s, especially as the time of prime, maturity of media market, of media industry, the rise of many publications, all of that is there. But the system that Putin was inexorably and systematically building, that politics is mine. Politics is in the Kremlin. Do not mess up with politics. You can make your noises, and for a long time, media, not television, right? Television was always under control. Large television stations with news coverage were always under control beginning in very early years of Putin's tenure. But newspapers, and then, of course, the world of the internet and all kinds of podcasts and all these new genres that emerged that were mastered brilliantly by very talented Russian people, did not make a difference in policymaking. They could play a role of organizing a community, and most of them had loyal and wonderful audience, educated, well-informed, with interest in many spheres of life, good, loyal audience, limited. And I would say no impact on policymaking. This is something that is very, very important to remember. Russian journalists mastered all there was to master at every stage in the way media in the world, and the best examples of those media demonstrated. Open source, digital journalism. I think we have excellent examples of wonderful journalists who mastered it to a level that is the highest in the world. I mean, not There are no others, but I'm sure there are journalists like that in this country, in the United States and elsewhere, but they were no inferior and they still operate now from exile.
This also brings me to the question of exile. And you've written in some past interviews that leaving Russia at the outset of the invasion of Ukraine was an emotional decision for you. Could you say a little bit more about that and what you remember from that time? And of course, many journalists left as well. So you just touched upon that theme of working from exile. So if you could share a little bit about the very decision, like how did that come about? How did that feel emotionally? And of course, about all these other people who left alongside with you to different parts of Europe and US and Canada and elsewhere, and how their work continues.
Right. I would say what happened in Russia very soon after the large-scale invasion of Ukraine is unique in the world history of media. That many dozens of publications got up and left. Altogether, hundreds of journalists scattered around the world. If you ask me, my decision to leave, I was not in immediate danger. I didn't feel that way. It was more the result of really a shock. My own country invaded a neighbor. There's a real war. There had been every indication that there would be war, but it was impossible to believe it. It was really, truly impossible, despite all the obvious signs and all the obvious preparations. When it actually happened, I, like so many people around me, experienced this state of shock. I cannot stay here any longer. So that was me. But for most,
Sorry, Maria, to be clear, you were in Russia at the time of the invasion.
Indeed.
So you left just after the invasion?
Some 10 days later.
And you left because of a principled stance. You thought, this is no good. I need to leave.
I would really call it somehow a moral impulse. That was the way I felt then. I just cannot stay there. I cannot stay in my country if my country invaded its neighbor. It was that. And I would emphasize that it was not my case that I thought my life was in danger. Well, I think had I stayed, I probably would have realized that I had to leave anyway because it was getting worse and worse. And the repressions grew harsher and harsher. But at the time, I did not feel like I was in immediate danger. It was not that. It was this moral impulse. But it was different for those dozens of Russian media which left because the government went after them, one after another. And the government very promptly was passing laws that actually made the operation of those media impossible, like technically, unless you wanted to go to jail. They became outlawed. It was a new law that, well, I'm oversimplifying it, but the point was that you cannot use sources about the war that we have not approved. You can only write what we say you should write. And there were special laws passed to this effect. So to them, it was a matter of survival, not individual survival, even though for some it may have been, but for their survival as media outlets. So one after another, in very quick succession, they were leaving as newsrooms. They were leaving altogether. Some of them are quite large newsrooms, scattered around the world from the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, Vilnius, Riga, some in Serbia, some indeed in the United States. I would say easily a dozen different countries where these journalists are now staying.
And when you talk about these journalists leaving and operating from abroad, how do you think about the efficacy of their work and their audiences? And earlier in the conversation, you talked about the marginal kind of impact of not opposition, but I guess critical journalists in contemporary Russia. And here they are fleeing Russia and going elsewhere and surviving, and they're resilient and impressive and continuing their work. But what do you think about their impact? And also thinking here about the tragic fate of Alexei Navalny, who chose to return to Russia, and how that, of course, ended. So, yeah, some thoughts on that would be really fascinating.
Let me start with Alexei Navalny, and I would repeat, and I think this is very important, that Alexei Navalny was a truly unique figure. As a person who was born to be a politician, who was extremely talented, a public politician who knew how to inspire people, how to lead people, how to inspire hope, even those that the situation did not look hopeful in the least. He was a political organizer, something that was unheard of in Russia, and reasonably successful at that. Up until, of course, he was first poisoned, and then when he recovered in Germany and came back to Russia, arrested and then died or quite likely killed. But this is, even though there was no chance for him, and he knew that he would come back and get arrested, I don't think there was any chance of him to achieve anything politically. However, his death is a terrible blow that cannot be overestimated. Because of his unique talents, people felt deeply disillusioned and distressed after Navalny was killed. And I would say that some people have recovered since then. People who are political activists or sympathizers or maybe worked for him or simply admired him from a distance. I think those people, many of them lost the little hope that they had entertained before. Now, about the journalists. Well, media in exile is not a healthy thing. To begin with, there is no business model for them. And this in itself is unhealthy. They live off vast majority of them live off Western grants, which may actually end at any moment when Western funders decide that what is it in it for me? And this is what funders do. I mean, they fund what they choose, what they think is important, but they can get disillusioned and find another noble cause and use their funding for something else. Anyway, no advertising, no paid subscription. This is not a viable model. And also, I think it is completely unprecedented that with dozens of media getting up and going. So there are, well, a few that are probably more viable than others, but I'm not sure in 10 years' time we will see all those journalists in the same places doing the same thing. It is also the obvious. Once you work from exile, your audience is divided. Part of it is in Russia. People use VPNs. They can actually join and listen and read. We live in an internet age, so this is not impossible. For somebody who is interested, they can actually read and listen, and this is not a huge problem. But of course, it takes more effort than just simply switch on your television or open your habitual website, of course. Yes, it takes effort. The audience dwindles. And I think it's natural and happens anywhere. And no matter how actually connected the world is, thanks to the internet, if your audience is partly in Russia, in a very unfree environment, and partly abroad, their thinking, their interests, their lifestyles diverge, even if they try to stay together. These are two different audiences, and this will be more and more conspicuous with time. And this is certainly a problem. So I think, well, media should work and live in the country where its audience is. It is not healthy for the media to be elsewhere and to be unable to somehow share the experience of everyday life with your compatriots in your audience. So I am unfortunately pessimistic about what is in store for all of those people, and I have many friends among them. And of course, talking about the impact, as I mentioned earlier, even when everyone worked from Russia, political impact was a challenge, and this is an understatement. In fact, political impact was not something that was possible for media to achieve in a political system in which the uncontested leader repeatedly sent a message, politics is mine. Political policymaking and decision-making is mine, not yours.
Maria, what do you think Americans should do right now? I'm kind of flipping everything, but we've been talking about Russia, but what should we do now in America?
Well, I'm afraid I'm not in a position to give advice to Americans. Well, indeed, I do not think I'm qualified and that even have a moral authority to give advice. But what makes me slightly hopeful is the American judiciary that is actually doing its job. And I think we see this on a daily basis. Not everyone, but there are unbending judges who continue fighting for their clients or for, it can be not an individual, but an institution, fighting against the decisions that they see as unlawful. And I think with independent judiciary being such an American achievement, such an American thing, I would lay my expectations on that.
So the public can relax and hope for the legal processes to proceed smoothly.
Well, I think, if there is this judiciary that is doing its job, I think this is something for the media to write about, to cover, to draw public attention to. And I think this is an ecosystem, if you like, which brings together the judiciary and the media and the public and representatives of various levels. I think all of this exists. And I understand that the country is very polarized. And by far, not everyone in the United States regards what is happening as a catastrophe or a huge problem. Maybe they hail it. Maybe many do. But for those who do not hail it and who see it as alarming and maybe a violation of the nature of American politics and American institutions, it's not a hard autocracy. There are a lot of unpleasant developments from the point of view of those people. But this is not the only news that I read daily. And as long as there's interest and support for those judges and for their operation, as long as there are representatives and governors and politicians locally, still in the United States, you do not have a heavily centralized system. You have states, you have different political sympathies and different political patterns in different states. There's political life to engage in. And there are goals that can be set and maybe achieved.
So when some Americans talk about leaving the country, I hear these conversations, routinely amongst colleagues, and sometimes it's posed as a joke or as almost like a fantasy. Sometimes it's a real decision that some are taking or planning or looking for jobs elsewhere, like Europe and Canada. Do you think this decision to flee or that kind of sentiment is premature? When you think about Americans or American citizens really considering this departure, time to depart, time to plan for this plan B or plan C if things really go worse here, or if the judges are not listened to by the president?
I think it is not premature, but it is very individual. I also hear these conversations about plan B, etc. in Canada. And I even know examples of people who left, even though very few. However, you mentioned jobs, right? This is not about mass exodus. This is not about refugees. We know this from the experience of so many countries. When it is not about a plan B, when you run for your life, this is not the United States. People may be thinking, and those who are, especially those who are young enough or actually wealthy enough or maybe old enough that they can maybe buy real estate elsewhere and spend their late years of their life in a different country, or maybe indeed young enough and don't have families to take care of. It is individual. And everything I hear, and I'm sure you hear, is of the same sort. This is not a life and death decision. People may resent what is going on around them and be disappointed, and they may weigh their variance. Is there, maybe, there is life for me in Canada, or maybe there's life for me in Germany. Or maybe let's remember I had a great-grandfather who was born in Germany and now I can claim German citizenship. It is about that. It is not about running for their lives. Or as the case was with Russian journalists, they had to leave because otherwise they faced, at best, the prospect of losing their job and losing their profession, and at worst, losing their freedom.
So it's a matter of at least some degree of privilege at this point if you are able to construct this kind of plan.
I hope you agree with me.
I do. Yeah. There's not a life-death situation just yet, but maybe, like you said, it's so personalized. Everybody has their own rationale or calculus as they're making these decisions. Well, on this note, we shall conclude this wonderful discussion. Thank you so much to Maria Lipman for joining us and offering this very rich insights about Russia, but also about the United States, life in exile, and many other important themes. The Rhyming Podcast is produced by me, Maria Lipman,
and me, Jeremy Goldkorn. The show is edited by Cadre Scripts. The theme music is Paperboy, composed and performed by Wu Fei on the guzheng. Our closing music is Eric Satie's Gymnopédie No. 1, arranged and performed also by Wu Fei. And our cover art is by Li Yunfei.
Please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, leave us a review, and if you like what we're doing, please take out a paid subscription at rhymingchaos.com, where you can also sign up for our newsletters. Thank you again, Maria. It was a real pleasure and honor.
Thank you, Maria.
Thanks for having me.
That was fascinating.